Welcome to Module 1, Trauma and Resilience. My name's Caitlin Young with Trillium Family Services, and I'm so happy you're taking the time to join in this opportunity for learning today. Here's an overview of our agenda for this session. Welcome, pre-assessment, mindful moment, creating a safety plan, definitions of trauma, stress, parallel process, and trauma-informed care, a brief overview of NEAR science, measuring resilience, break, and then small group breakouts. As I mentioned, mindfulness practices are woven into each module as an opportunity to practice self-care and present moment experience. These two aspects can be tools for improving workforce wellness. It's 100% your choice if you follow along with this activity or simply take the next couple of minutes to do something else that you find to be restorative or nourishing. Today's mindfulness practice is called 3-minute breathing space. This exercise is adapted from mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy. The hope is that you can practice being present with yourself and the various aspects of yourself for the next 3 minutes. This activity is about accepting what is and practicing self-kindness and an attitude of non-judgment toward yourself. So here's an overview. The first minute, we'll be asking ourselves, what's my experience right now? Here we're going to be noticing thoughts or emotional states that are present. Second minute, we're going to focus full attention on the sensations of the breath. Third minute, we'll extend our awareness to the body as a whole. Notice facial expression, posture, and sensations. I invite you to find a comfortable seat. Plant your feet on the floor and find a little bit of length through your spine. I invite you to close your eyes if you'd like. And for this first minute, please ask yourself, what is my experience right now? Notice any thoughts or emotional states that are present. And again, whatever you find, please meet yourself with kindness and with compassion. As you're ready, transitioning your attention now to the sensations of your breath. Notice the way your lungs feel as they fill and empty. You might notice where the breath is moving in your body. You might notice the pace or the sound of your breath. And meeting yourself with curiosity and kindness. For this third and final minute of our mindfulness practice, please extend your awareness to the body as a whole. You notice facial expression, posture, and any physical sensations. Again, meeting yourself with kindness, with curiosity, and with compassion. And now bring yourself back, perhaps floating your eyes open, bringing some movement, maybe taking a stretch. And we'll carry on. We're going to dive right in with a tool. This tool is called a safety plan. It was developed by Dr. Sandra Bloom as part of the Sanctuary model of trauma-informed care. We're introducing this tool before we dive into the lecture portion of this module because the hope is you can use it or call on it if you begin to feel overwhelmed at any point during the training or throughout your day. Talking about stress and trauma can be a lot. This is an experiential training, so we'll be practicing tools as we learn. So what is a safety plan? A safety plan is a list of self-regulating activities that a person can choose when feeling overwhelmed to help with coping. Safety plans help people stay safe in the moment by helping them regulate their emotions. So when we think about intense stress or panic, having a safety plan to reference can help people feel a sense of control over feelings and behaviors that have felt beyond their ability to control. It's often a good place to start when making a safety plan is to identify what types of emotions are most difficult to manage. Is it anger, anxiety, sadness, maybe a swirl of feelings at once? This exercise of creating a safety plan can be a lesson in building your own emotional intelligence. So what are self-regulating options? These are things you can do yourself. They're relational tools that can be done anytime or anywhere, in your office, in the middle of a heated discussion. Ideally, these are things you don't need a lot of time or extra accessories for. So some examples might be breathing or counting or looking up at the sky. Self-care and safety plans are actually two different tools that contribute to overall well-being. Self-care strategies are the things you do on a consistent basis to help you show up as the best version of yourself. These might be things like healthy sleep habits, exercise, a spiritual practice, good nutrition, going to therapy. Safety plan items are those things that are easy to access, quick things. They only take a minute or two. Therefore, there's less obstacles in practicing them. On my safety plan, I have taking deep breaths, looking at the sky, taking a drink of water, having a stretch, or maybe even listening to a song. So take a moment, write down 3 to 5 things that you can do to stay safe. Write them down on a sticky note, plug them into your phone. I encourage you to use these tools anytime when you feel stress, overwhelm, or triggered. So now we're going to transition into some key definitions. Trauma, stress, collective disturbance, and trauma-informed care. Please take good care of yourselves. I've got a lot of content headed your way. And this is just an overview. Each of these topics could be its own lesson or workshop. I'll share resources for continued learning in the reference and resource slide at the end of the module. What is trauma? The Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration defines trauma using the 3 E's: event, a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or as threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning or physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Trauma can have many definitions. It can be one event, it can be an ongoing event, a community trauma, an organizational trauma, or more. When some people think about trauma, they think of physical injury. Some think of abuse and neglect. In addition to these definitions, we're going to define trauma more broadly. Trauma-Informed Oregon shares a list of the types of trauma that include ageism, ableism, classism, racism, Islamophobia, sexism, and hate crimes. These are examples of structural violence or systemic oppression. This is the idea that institutions and social structures have prevented people from getting their basic needs met, and these experiences have profound traumatic effects on a person. We'll include bullying as a type of trauma, unexpected or sudden death, war, assault, domestic violence, witnessing violence. And this is obviously not a complete list of traumatic events. Please use the chat box and participate if you'd like. How do you define trauma? How does your system define trauma? And how does that impact how you're doing the work? Now let's take a few minutes and talk about the different types of stress. So there's positive stress. This is something that we all need. It's part of our healthy development. It helps us get through something that we need to do. Some examples of positive stress could be taking a test, going to a job interview, public speaking. Tolerable stress. Here, stress hormones and chemicals are severe enough to change the brain architecture. This might disrupt your sleep. It could make you have a difficult time thinking clearly or making decisions. But if it's buffered by supportive relationships or healthy coping skills, for example, if you're overwhelmed by your workload and you have a trusted support person or a stress-reducing exercise routine that help make things more tolerable. Then there's toxic stress. It's severe enough to change your brain architecture, it's prolonged over time, and without the caring, buffering, or protective relationship. Some people don't think they have trauma, but may be experiencing toxic stress. Toxic stress and trauma have a similar effect on your brain and your stress hormones. Many folks in the helping professions experience toxic stress. So trauma occurs when the adversity outweighs your ability to cope. It can be helpful to hold a broad definition of trauma. It really is any time a situation compromises our ability to cope and when our internal and external resources are depleted and inadequate to support the external threat. That's when we see trauma symptoms. The terms trauma, toxic stress, and adversity can be used interchangeably. As trauma-informed helpers, we can help someone move from toxic to tolerable stress. We could be that protective relationship or that support. So it's not just the event that determines whether something is traumatic to someone, but it's also the individual's experience of the event, the meaning they make of it, and their access to healthy coping strategies and support. Now, we know that something traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another, and that each person may even react differently to the trauma. Think about a group of people who all experience a home evacuation as a result of a wildfire. An entire community may be evacuated, and luckily, in this example, nobody experienced physical injury or lost property. However, one neighbor may experience symptoms of trauma like flashbacks or panic attacks for years after the event, and another neighbor may not endure any lasting traumatic symptoms after the perceived threat is gone. So why is this? We must understand that the internal and external resources are needed to support healing, to reduce the impacts of trauma, because it's not only the event that determines if something is traumatic or not, but it's the social determinants of health, vulnerabilities of development, chronic experiences, previous or current experiences that all come together to create the outcome that we may see as trauma. So neighbor number one may have a supportive social network and financial resources in place to recover if their home is lost. And neighbor number two may be experiencing isolation, exposure to previous traumatic events, and an economic situation such that a loss of a home could result in homelessness. We're going to talk about trauma theory. Trauma theory gives us a framework to plug in all the models, approaches, tools that we use across delivery systems. So think about healthcare workers, bus drivers, social workers, teachers. We all use different verbiage in our day-to-day work. But trauma-informed care is our shared framework. Trauma theory is more about how we approach our work and the values that we hold as helpers, not what exactly our day-to-day tasks entail. Trauma theory is our operating system, so we can still use all of our applications and models for doing the work. Parallel process. So systems are every bit as susceptible to stress and strain and trauma as the individuals who live and work within them. Parallel process is when two or more systems, whether these consist of individuals, groups, or organizations, have significant relationships with one another. They tend to develop similar thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. These can be positive or challenging. Organizations are living, growing, changing systems with their own unique biology. They're vulnerable to stress, particularly chronic and repetitive stress. They can be traumatized, and the result of traumatic experience can be as devastating for organizations as it is for individuals. So the term parallel process helps us understand that there's often a parallel experience between service users, staff, and organizations. Think of a service user who enters a system feeling very overwhelmed. They encounter a staff member who's overworked, stressed, and overwhelmed, and working for an organization that is navigating the overwhelm of staffing shortages and budget cuts. Overwhelming all around, right? Does this sound familiar? Trauma-informed care emerged out of the need inherent in the fact that individuals and systems experience trauma and that healing is possible. So now that we've talked about some of the key definitions of stress and trauma on an individual level, we've talked about parallel process. Let's zoom out to more of an organizational and systems level and talk about trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care, or practice, is a strengths-based process to increase awareness and understanding of the impacts of trauma. Trauma can impact individuals and communities physically, psychologically, and emotionally. Trauma-informed care works to create opportunities to emphasize safety and teach skills to manage feelings and work through the ongoing change to promote an environment for healing and growth. So how does a system become trauma-informed? One of the most incredible resources for trauma-informed transformation in Oregon is Trauma-Informed Oregon. A little backstory. In June of 2014, the Oregon Health Authority, or the Health Systems Division, which was formerly Addictions and Mental Health, contracted with Portland State University and Oregon Health and Science University and the Oregon Pediatric Society to initiate a statewide collaboration to promote and sustain trauma-informed care across child and family-serving organizations or systems. In July of 2015, the scope of this collaboration was expanded to include adult-serving behavioral health systems. So Trauma-Informed Oregon was created in recognition of the impact that adverse experiences in childhood have a long-term health impact. And this represents a commitment at the state level to promote prevention and bring policies and practices into better alignment with the principles of trauma-informed care. So Trauma-Informed Oregon serves as a centralized source of information and resources. They offer trainings, and they work with state agencies, providers, communities, family and youth organizations, and they try to bring many voices and perspectives to the table so that we can all learn from one another and advocate for changing policies and practices that promote healing and support well-being for everyone across the state of Oregon. There are so many incredible resources. Please check them out. They include free trainings. So let's get into the weeds here of what makes an organization trauma-informed. Trauma-Informed Oregon uses the definition of trauma-informed care from SAMHSA. This is the 4 R's. A program or organization or system is trauma-informed when it realizes the widespread impact of trauma and pathways to recovery. It's a great place to start. Notice it's not an individual or family group, it's about an organizational change. The second is recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity. Recognize it in those you serve, in your staff, in your workforce. So workforce wellness is a key piece of being trauma-informed. Third, respond by integrating your knowledge, realizations, and recognition. Do something. Don't just pause with awareness. There's a great example that Trauma Informed Oregon shared in a training of an anti-poverty organization that has a policy where all staff at the beginning of their performance year need to identify one vacation that is at least 5 days in a row. And this is an example of a trauma-informed care policy that prioritizes self-care, time off, allows for folks to come back to work with a refreshed mindset. The fourth is to actively resist re-traumatizing people. This is very much about how we do what we do. How can we make potentially traumatic situations like removing a child from their home less traumatic? An example from a child in the Child Protective Services system, an interview with a youth asked, if you need to come in the night with sirens, with police, please turn off the sirens, they're scary. So let's look at all of this together. The 3 E's, the 4 R's, the 6 key principles, which we actually talked about at the top when we provided an example to guide our virtual meeting structure. The fourth category is the implementation domains. Most of these are about how the organization functions, not what is provided directly. Trauma takes away power, choice, and safety, and trauma-informed is a commitment to give these things back whenever possible. Trauma-informed care is about why we do what we do. It's not about being nicer or eliminating boundaries. Trauma-informed care is about empowerment. So you can be trauma-informed without using the word trauma. And it doesn't mean that we focus on the negative. It means we're doing something with the information that we have. We're building workforce wellness policies. We're changing procedures. We're disrupting problem cycles. We're enhancing physical environments. Inherent in the need to deliver trauma-informed care is the acknowledgement of the role of systemic oppression. This will be the primary focus in Module 2. We try to engage folks in services that we might think work, but nobody's showing up. Perhaps this is because of the systems that we represent, or the way that people feel when they visit our buildings, or the questions we ask, or the way that we ask them. Institutions have done real harm, and that's recognized as part of the trauma experience. So trauma-informed care has a very systemic focus. So what is the difference between trauma-informed and trauma-specific? Let's take a moment to clarify the difference between trauma-informed and trauma-specific. Trauma-informed care takes into account knowledge about trauma in all aspects of service delivery, everything from policy, procedure, physical space, actual practice. The primary purpose is not about treatment. It's about creating services that allow users and staff to engage in the service and feel safe while doing so. Trauma-specific treatment directly assesses trauma and its impact and offers healing modalities. So any business or organization can be trauma-informed, but organizations or practitioners dedicated to trauma healing are trauma-specific. So an example would be Trillium Family Services. We provide mental health therapy to youth, many of whom have survived trauma. In order to be trauma-informed, one does not have to provide trauma-specific services. So one grounding assumption of trauma-informed care is that every interaction with a trauma survivor has the opportunity to activate, re-traumatize, or heal. Now we're going to take a skim of the surface of what we call near science. N is for neurobiology. It gives us information about how toxic stress and adversity and trauma impacts the way our brains develop and function. E is for epigenetics, which helps us understand how adversity is transmitted across generations. And in a sense, it scientifically affirms that individual and collective trauma can be passed down from generation to generation. A is for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This study scientifically affirmed that experiencing trauma or adversity in childhood is linked to poor health outcomes later in life. R is for resilience. Knowledge about resilience confirms that buffering variables can reverse, prevent, and heal trauma. We'll dig a little deeper. Neurobiology gives us information about how toxic stress and adversity impacts how our brains develop and function. We're going to talk about Dan Siegel's hand-brain model. Easily demonstrates what happens when we have a real or perceived threat. The hand is your brain, the fingers are your prefrontal cortex, and the frontal lobe, which is rational thinking, decision-making, verbal processing. When we have a real or perceived threat, we flip our lids. Part of our brains go offline and we go into survival mode. Now all we care about is survival. We're not accessing the verbal processing, pros and cons, prioritization. Our systems themselves are often a perceived threat. This could be because of what our organization represents or some past experiences. It could be our signage, our uniforms, our sirens might be triggers that flip lids. Our brain's impacted when our lids are flipped, so specifically sensory awareness, attention, memory, and executive functions of the brain that are impacted. Sensory awareness. So when our lids flipped, we're more heightened to senses around us. Things are brighter, louder, they touch and taste different. This is a survival mechanism. In the chat box, think for a moment about where you do your work. What sights, smells, sounds do people engage with as they're working with you? It can be really helpful to pay attention to these things. The second, attention, impacted by toxic stress. When you're activated, it's difficult to focus on one thing at a time. You're paying attention to everything a little bit. This might make it difficult to remember what you're saying or have folks remember what you're asking them to do because their brains are tracking the experience differently. The third is memory. Short-term memory storage is impacted by trauma and toxic stress. This can cause us to forget things like paperwork, assignments, appointments. And then executive functioning is impacted. This is what helps us organize and regulate our impulses. When our lids are flipped, it makes it hard to plan and organize. In trauma-informed care, we pay attention to how we ourselves, our procedures, or our organizations may be the perceived threat, how this could flip someone's lid and in turn impact their ability to engage in our services and our ability to engage with them. So we can use this knowledge to provide better care. Another way to think about this is the window of tolerance. We all experience stress, right? We all experience overwhelm. And we all have different size windows for what we can tolerate based on our past experiences, our strengths and buffers, and the imprinted patterns within our brains. So the window of tolerance is the ability of the brain to tolerate intense emotion and to retain a sense of security. The brain of a trauma survivor generally has a smaller window of tolerance than the brain of a non-survivor. When the brain reaches the edge of its window of tolerance, it goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode. So when a person has a larger window of tolerance, they're better able to cope with stressors. And when folks come into access with our services or work with us, trauma-informed care teaches us to meet one another with our lids on and within our windows of tolerance. E is for epigenetics. This helps us understand how toxic stress and adversity is transmitted and experienced across generation. It helps us learn about the impact of historical and collective trauma for populations. The adage is that you're not what you ate, but you are what your grandparents ate. This field of knowledge is helping us understand how trauma and the impact is transmitted across generations. The ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, was conducted by Kaiser Permanente between 1995 and 97. Over 17,000 patient volunteers were asked about their adverse experiences in childhood. The study looked at 10 adverse experiences, including physical, emotional, sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, an adult in the home who had an untreated mental illness, an adult in the home who was incarcerated, a mother who was treated violently, untreated substance use in the home, and divorce. The ACEs study highlighted a direct link between adversity in childhood and poor health outcomes for adults. Adversity in childhood leads to disrupted neural development. Because the lid is flipped during trauma, it impacts neural development. Disrupted neural development then can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. These impairments often lead to health risk behaviors like substance use. And these things can lead to social problems and disease, and then these things can lead to an early death. This pyramid is an update to the original ACEs pyramid, and it was done by a group called RYSE in California. It's a group of youth and providers that looked at the ACEs study and adapted it to a pyramid that begins with historical trauma or epigenetics and how this experience leads into social location or access to services, and from there can lead to ACEs and complex trauma. Next, we're going to talk about resiliency. Resiliency helps us know what we can do to reverse, prevent, and treat trauma and adversity. Dr. Wendy Ellis from the Building Community Resilience Collaborative says that resilience is a process of healing. Healing is marked with scars. The scar is a seam that comes together to create something stronger. The scar aims to close a vulnerability from which strength arises. Always remember, from vulnerability arises strength. The American Psychological Association defines this as a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relationship problems. So we look at resilience like elasticity. You can stretch a rubber band pretty far and it will return back to its normal state over time. Similarly, the calla lilies on this slide, they can be uprooted, they can go through a trauma, they can be planted, replanted with care and time and nutrients, sunshine, rain. Our hope is that they return to a state of health again. And how do we learn resilience? We can learn it naturally and passively through life events, through social connections. We can build resilience through social supports, counseling, coaching, staff training. Resilience is not something that we're necessarily born with. It's something that we learn through either natural or passive events in our lives or through social connections, or we can be taught them. How do we measure resilience? How could measuring resilience be helpful to do? So often our human services are focused on disease and dysfunction, and assessing for strengths as a part of our initial connection with the service user can set a positive tone for building a relationship. There are hundreds of scales out there that measure resilience, used by different disciplines to measure resilience. And one that's recently caught my attention is the Adult Resilience Scale, or ARM. And in the chat box, how do you assess for strengths within your organizations? What tools or questions do you use? And if you aren't already, do you think integrating a resilience measure into your program could be useful? Please share in the chat. So the Adult Resilience Measure is one of the surveys that's been frequently used to measure resilience. And this measure has been used locally by Oregon State University Cascades and Better Together in their 2020 resilience report for the Central Oregon school districts. The Child and Youth Resilience Measure, or CYRM, and the Adult Resilience Measure are self-report measures of social ecological resilience and are used by researchers and practitioners worldwide. The scale includes 17 questions with no hard cutoff for levels, but a suggestion is to look at high, moderate, and low groupings based on the population surveyed. So it looks at support within a system, a family, some basic survival needs such as food and housing, feelings of belonging, cultural celebrations, getting along with others, feeling seen or known or understood by others, a commitment to learning or skill building, having someone to talk to about your feelings. I really appreciate this strength-based assessment that looks to celebrate the ways in which people are strong. It'll be linked in the resource page. It's also free to download. To close our lecture for Module 1, we're going to watch a keynote video from Trauma Informed Oregon that asks a diverse group of folks what trauma-informed care is and why it's important. Thank you so much for your time, participation, and presence today.
Healing.
Resilience.
Connection.
Transformative.
Dignity.
It means generational healing.
Hope.
Compassion.
Access.
Inclusion.
Inclusion.
Acknowledgement.
Safety.
Resilience.
Relationships.
Curiosity.
Knowledge.
Trauma-informed care is true equity.
To be contagious in a positive, informative way creates a stronger generation of people to come after us.
We come from all different walks of life and experiences, and it's important to acknowledge that.
That we now know that racism is a form of trauma.
Long-standing stigma that people do not recover.
If you don't understand where somebody's coming from, then it's hard to help them.
Because it empowers people.
It saves maternal and child welfare and lives.
Because I love people, and I think this is how we all get free.
We as a community are finally being seen, we're being talked about, and we're being included.
The people of color in my community, it's important for us to be informed of our own trauma and for others to be informed so they know how to work with us.
Because it holds systems and organizations accountable for how we do the work.
the biggest impact has been something small, which has been Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain, which within our team we use to help us all be able to say when life is overwhelming and we need a break.
It has changed the discourse from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you.
So building on our strengths and acknowledging the resiliency that we have had from one generation to the next.
I think we have all embarked on a collective hero's journey, and now some of us are aware of it.
The combination of violence awareness, resources, and materials that are accessible with the acknowledgement of the effects of historic trauma in the disability community.
Witnessing people open their minds and shift to a non-judgmental attitude or presence even that wasn't fully nurtured before and now is.
Trauma-informed care aims to break down barriers that impede the growth of foster youth.
Staff has a chance to puzzle through real-world experiences in a way to decide how they're going to handle situations before they arise.
It creates more empathy based on lived experience.
It has just made us better people.
Offering aid that levels in a way that levels the playing field in this game that we call life. Empathy.
Patience.
Policy.
Support.
Self-awareness.
Sustainability of the workforce. Training. Compassion.
Accountability.
Collaboration.
Trust.
Systematic change. I know that's not one word, but it does need to be changed on all levels and all systems.
Listening.
Attunement.
Understanding.
Education.
Education, definitely.
Dedication.
Community. Value. Have value in the community.
There's that one word again. Persistence.
Power.